Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday, March 15th, 2023. And this week on the Coastal Community, we're going to talk about special flight operations certificates, or how to break the law and get away with it. So what is a special flight operations certificate? Well, let's start it with the basics and advanced, or the regular Part 9, Subpart 1 regulatory structure for drones, right? So if your drone weighs between 250 grams and 25 kilograms, and you're conducting normal operations within the normal drone rule set, they're going to be within either a basic or advanced operations category. Basic, of course, we break this down, is you can fly up to near aerodromes or uncertified airports. You can fly more than 3 nautical miles away from airports. You can fly 1 nautical mile away from heliports. Outside of controlled airspace, so Class G or Class F advisory airspace, and you must be at all times 100 feet away from bystanders. Advanced operations, just to recap, is any flights with a drone that are in controlled airspace, near airports, near heliports, less than 100 feet horizontally from bystanders, and or over people, or complex SFOC operations that we're going to get into today. So if your flight isn't in any of these two categories, it's a special flight operation. So then it's outside of CARS 901. So what does that mean? Here are all the rules that have an allowance in them for special flight operations certificate. So CARS 903. The way the CARS are broken out, there's CARS 900, 900 being the base of all RPAS operations. And then subpart 1, or 901, is 250 to 25 kilogram normal, so basic or advanced operations. And then 902 has nothing at the moment. It's reserved for future growth. And then 903 is SFOC, so special flight operations. So anything that is beyond the rule set that has been granted special authority to operate under the minister's approval. So before CARS 901 existed, all drone flights that were commercial or in built up areas were SFOC flights. So they were considered beyond normal operations. So in order for those flights to happen, they needed to have a special flight operations certificate. Now that we've got 901, which allows for both basic and advanced operations, we have still some exceptions to that and standard practice for operating beyond that 903. So technically breaking the law. What are those laws that we're allowed to break with permission? Beyond visual line of sight, so CARS 901.11, having one visual observer to keep track of multiple drones at a time, that's a limit. If you're going to fly over 400 feet in uncontrolled airspace and you're not close to a structure, so not within 200 feet of that structure horizontally and 100 feet above it. If you're going to operate more than 5 RPAs at the same time from the same ground control station. You can't have 5 remotes in front of you, but you can have, for example, 1 laptop operating up to 5 RPAs at the same time under CARS 901. If you have more than that, like a drone light show, it's going to be an SFOC. If you want to operate a drone at a special aviation or an advertised event, there is a distinction between the two. If you want to carry a payload that is either explosive, corrosive, flammable, or a biohazard, or if it's suspended by a long line outside of the drone manufacturer's specific instructions. So if the drone allows for you to suspend something by a long line, you don't need an SFOC. But if you attach something to a drone by tape or wrap or what, a modification to the drone, that's an SFOC. If you want to operate an RPAS or a drone within 3 nautical miles of a Department of National Defense aerodrome, it must have an SFOC. And if you're a foreign pilot or a foreign drone owner, you must have an SFOC. And finally, there's a catch-all that anything else the minister delegates as requiring an SFOC will require an SFOC. So if they decide it's too complicated for normal operations and it requires an SFOC, they have the right to require that. So Transport Canada breaks down SFOCs into either complex or simple. Simple SFOCs are going to be a foreign pilot operations requirement or operating at an advertised outdoor event, such as a concert, a festival, a market, a town fair. If you're operating the drone over a gathering of people that is open to the public, that's considered a simple SFOC. It still has a process to go through, but it's not as complicated as a complex SFOC. Complex being everything else we've previously mentioned. So the general requirements for all SFOCs included, but mainly as simple, is you have to have a pilot certificate. And a pilot certificate is a proof of a pilot exam and a flight review if required for the operation. You need to have a proof of recency. This is kind of the same as CARS Part 9 or 901, so Part 1. You need to define your standard operating procedures. So not only your pre-flight, your takeoff, your during flight approach, landing, recovery, and your emergency procedures. You also will need to have some sort of contingency plans and emergency plans for any operations that go awry. You need to have either a registration for the drone you plan to use for the advertised event, or if you're applying for a foreign pilot, you need to have the serial number or the ESN and the type description of the RPA you're going to use, because you can't register an RPA as a foreign owner. You'll need some sort of declaration of conformity or safety assurance declaration if you're going to be applying for an advanced operation. So if it's an advertised event, it's very likely that you're going to be flying over people. In order to fly that drone over people, it must have some sort of declaration that says it is safe to fly over people. In an SFOC, it becomes like a declaration of conformity. It is basically the same thing as the manufacturer's assurance declaration. If you're operating, let's say, a Mavic 3 with a parachute that already has a safety assurance declaration that's listed on Transport Canada, then that's sufficient. Your certificate of registration would have that declaration on the right side. That's a sufficient declaration in order to use that drone at a public event. You'll need to do a site survey just like you have to do for every drone operation. So you'll have to, but in this case, you have to provide it in writing as part of your application. So that's complying with CARS 90127. That's the standard A through H site survey that you look at. And then you're also going to have to write out a concept of operations. So that's going to be the general purpose of your flight. For all SFOC applications, you must give more than 30 business days of notice before the start of the operation, or Transport Canada will automatically reject the application. They won't even look at it. So how does that work with business, or for, say, you're a drone operator and you get a short notice call for an advertised event? Well, Transport's thought of that. For advertised events, as long as it's a simple, not a complex operation as well, so over 400, overweight, over beyond line of sight, if it's a normal advertised event and you need an SFOC, you can get a standing SFOC for advertised events that is Canada-wide and annually issued. So it'll be approved from, or it'll be valid for 12 months from the date of approval. You'll then be required to update Transport Canada with the specific aviation event that you're going to, with a minimum of 5 business days notice. So if you have a standing approval that, yes, all my normal operations make sense for flight over people at an advertised event, you would then be assigned a Transport Canada number and an inspector. And if you get a call to do an advertised event, you would then update your inspector with your site survey for that location, the general concept of what that specific is. So say you get a parade that you get asked to film with the drone. You would then provide those details to your inspector. They would issue an approval for that specific event in roughly 5 business days. So it's not a full 30 business days notice. When you start getting into complex SFOCs, so in addition to everything we just talked about for simple requirements, it's not specific, but one of the big components of getting an SFOC approved is pilot competency. You don't need an advanced pilot certificate to fly a heavy drone in Class G, but a big part of risk mitigation is proof of pilot competency. And what that really means is it's going to be an advanced pilot certificate that they're looking to see and proof that the pilots have completed a flight review. So there's demonstrated competency from the pilot. You'll need to do a concept of operations again. For a complex SFOC, it's going to be very detailed. It's going to be multiple pages. You're going to have to do a full risk assessment of the operation. It's called a specific operations risk assessment, or a SORA, and Transport Canada has provided specific guidance on how to do that assessment, because that's going to drive other requirements through the process. You're going to also have to list out all your strategies for how you mitigate that risk. So if you identify that there's a risk of the drone flying away into controlled airspace on a strong windy day, how are you going to mitigate that, or how are you going to prevent that from happening in most reasonable circumstances? You're going to, again, need a declaration of conformity from the drone manufacturer. In this case, it's going to be a SAIL conformity, or the specific aviation integrity level, which is derived from your risk assessment. The higher the risk, the higher the SAIL, or the integrity level, must be on the drone. You're going to also need proof of manufacturer competency. You can't apply for a complex SFOC with a fly-by-night drone manufacturer. They're going to be looking at things like, does the drone manufacturer have any kind of ISO standard accreditation, or have they got proof of training for maintenance, proof of training for operations? So you can certainly do it with a novel, completely from scratch drone, but understand that entire process might take weeks, if not months, to get all the paperwork to a point where Transport Canada has confidence that your drone operation is not going to be a risk to aviation or personal safety. And finally, if you're doing if your operation requires you to communicate with aviation, you'll have to have a restricted operator certificate. So for over 400 feet or for beyond visual line of sight, you will need to have an ROC-A. So Transport Canada has put out some guidance material that makes this more straightforward. It's not easy. It's a lot of work to apply for an SFOC, but they have built out some guidance material. So TCAC 903-001, again, these are advisory circulars. So 903 is the CARS rule set that they apply to. And then, of course, the next set is the document number. So document number 1 is how to complete a SORA, or how to complete the specific operational risk assessment. And what it'll show you, and I'm going to bring it up here in a second, is how to calculate your air risk class and your ground risk class. Air risk being how much risk is the drone to aviation surrounding your area of operation. And then GRC is how risky is the drone to people operating near or below the drone. Document 2 is how to prepare your application and general information about what is expected to be in the document, language it's meant to be used, and then general information about the application process. And then last year, roughly March, they came out with an Appendix D for document number 1 that goes into standard SFOC scenarios. And they have example outlines of the most common SFOCs that Transport Canada gets. Now, to give you an idea, in the last 2 years, there was only about 150 to 180 SFOCs that have been approved by Transport Canada. So the number of beyond line of sight, over 400 foot, special application operations is actually quite low. Now, personally, I'm concerned with that number, because I think realistically, we've got 80,000 drone pilots. We've got 10,000 advanced operators across Canada, and thousands of drone flights per day across Canada. The realities of it only being 150, I think, speaks more to compliance than it does to demand. I think there's an incredible amount of demand for beyond visual line of sight and for over 400 and overweight operations out there. We're seeing it on the agriculture side. We see it on the cinema side. And I think what's happening is compliance just isn't there, because the perceived complexity of this operation, it just seems insurmountable and unrealistic. Let me just see. That, I think, is the end of my slides. So let's go to take a look at the sample documents that Transport Canada has. So, okay, so in the Coastal Drone Pro Monthly, I've uploaded these because sometimes they're a little hard to find. So the advisory circular, and then also the SORA and the SFOC guidance. So the, let's see here. So 903-001 is the SORA guidance document. Let's bring that full screen. And you can see that this document, it is, how many pages? 69 pages. So it is a lengthy document that goes through how to determine your risk, the process for doing it, figuring out your operational volume. So what's a normal considered area, some considerations about that. And then you can start calculating your air risk and your GRC. So in here, and then of course, all the abbreviations that are used in the SFOC specific language. So they've taken the JARUS, which is the Joint Association for Remote Unmanned. So this guy here, the Joint Authority for Rulemaking of Unmanned Systems. This is version 2.0. It's the current valid version. 2.5 was just previewed or publicly launched, but I don't think it's been adopted internationally yet. At this point, there's some minor changes, but it's more about simplifying the process. The fundamental concept of it is still the same. This is a publicly available document, and we have it in the CDP as well. But the SORA process basically is to determine, right? So you need to establish your concept of operations, determine the ground risk class. So is the drone going to be unsafe to anyone in the area that is not part of the operation? Mitigate that ground risk. So determine if I put up fences around the drone, or if I use a tether, or if I have a parachute or some sort of flight termination system that prevents the drone from hurting someone, will that reduce my ground risk class? And then I figure out, is it lower or equal to a certain number? So in this case, it's saying 7. If it's not, then it's probably too high and you can't. So it's beyond an SFOC. If it's below, then I'd start looking at the initial air risk. Like, what's the chances of so first off, what kind of airspace are we going to fly this in? Is it controlled or uncontrolled airspace? Am I within a built-up area? Am I near an airport? Am I in the flight path of a heliport or a medevac helicopters? Those will all add to the number that my air risk class is. And then same thing, we go back and say, okay, well, we're in controlled airspace, but we can geofence the drone. We can make sure that it won't fly beyond 1 nautical mile from our area of operation, or we can set up specific areas where it can't fly, or we've got a strobe light on it, so it's got increased visibility. There's a bunch of different things you can do specific to the operation you want to do that can reduce your air risk class. As long as they're tangible and reasonable mitigations and you can justify them, and they actually work, they can be tangibly used to lower your air risk class. That air risk is multiplied against the ground risk, and then you get your SAIL, your specific determination. Once you have your SAIL, if it's at a certain level or higher, then there are very specific safety objectives that must be dealt with and addressed before you can move forward. So it's a 10-step process to complete your SORA. Now the Canadianized one, so what Canada has done, as I mentioned, there's the 90301 standard document. There's guidance on what is considered a populated area. It's in Appendix G. And then Appendix D is standard scenario. So let's bring this one full screen here. So what they've done is they've taken the JARUS SORA and they've applied it to the most common SFOC requests they get for complex operations. So drone takeoff weight of more than 25 kilograms up to 600 kilograms over controlled ground areas. So that's areas that have got a perimeter, a fence, or some sort of security so that there's no risk below the drone. And it's also in low risk airspace, which is considered Class G unpopulated airspace. SCSC2 is also for a heavy lift drone, so from 25 up to 150 kilograms over controlled ground areas, so no low ground risk, and any airspace. So this category can be flown in controlled airspace near airports, but it still can't be flown near people. And then for STSC3, it's for more than 250 grams up to 25, so normal, but in Class G airspace, so uncontrolled airspace above 400 feet. So if you need to fly to 1,000 or 2,000 feet, STSC3 for a Mavic 3, for example, this would be an location for it. And then STSC4 is, again, a small drone, a small RPA from 250 up to 25 kilograms over a low risk ground area and in low risk airspace, so uncontrolled airspace, using visual observer detect and avoid DAA that allows you to fly beyond visual line of sight. So this is the process by which you would get approved to fly a Mavic 3 or an Inspire or a Matrice beyond visual line of sight of the operator, but you must have some sort of detect and avoid. And in this case, it's using people that are in constant communication with the pilot and command to be looking for aircraft. So STSC2 is most commonly going to be used by the film industry or for aerial application. For example, the Agris T40 is about 105 kilograms fully loaded, so it still falls within that class. And then STSC 4 is going to be most likely used by mapping companies, right? So they're going to be in the middle of nowhere doing a Class G operation. It would normally be considered a basic, but it's not practical to have full line of sight of the drone for 10 miles, let's say. And then what is practical is to have visual observers every mile along that route that all have constant communication through real-time chat, either by VHF or by phone. And their job is to detect and avoid. Their job is to look for crewed aircraft, airplanes and helicopters that are potentially in the area that they could then immediately stop the operation because now they're becoming a hazard. That's kind of like a really brief summary of what that scenario would look like. So this document, if we go and look at, there's STSC3. Well, okay, here's STSC3. So a small drone, visual line of sight, Class G airspace going above 400 feet. So, and it's intended to be used as part of the application process for an SFOC. So this is not the entire application. Like I said, these are appendixes that can be used to help framework your application for that SFOC. So it defines the scope that it works in, and it must be exactly this scope or else this STSC doesn't work. As soon as you start modifying the conditions, like say I wanted to do above 400 feet in Class G airspace, but it's near people. Now it's no longer in this scenario and I'd have to modify it. So the application process would be, you have to demonstrate operator competency. So you have to have a company operations manual for your drone, and then you have to have advanced pilot certificates. You have to have a maintenance program for your drone that's defined by the manufacturer. And then you have to have proof that you're complying with your evidence, that your maintenance program. So your maintenance records as required, and any training that's required to maintain the drone. Pre-flight inspection. So this is your standard operating procedures. That's 90123. And the same with the standard operational procedures. You have to have proof that you've done crew training. So your standard operating procedures should define how you're going to fly over 400 feet, where you're going to fly, and what the restrictions and what the conditions and how do you do it safely needs to be identified in your manual. But then you also need to have proof that the people that are doing it have completed that manual or understand it and have completed some sort of training program. It can be an internal training certificate. It can just be an attendance record, but you have to have proof. If you're working with multi-crew, you have to have SOPs for communications with that crew. Again, like if you spot an aircraft, what are you going to say to the pilot in command? Crew fitness policy. So that's, is everyone fit to fly? You can follow the I'm safe checklist and make sure that you're fit to fly as per CAR. So no alcohol, no drugs, no influence there, right? And then our RPAS at environmental limits. So is the operation still within the limitations specified by the drone? So if it's a Mavic 3, for example, and the maximum speed, the maximum wind resistance is 12 meters per second, you have an SOP, a standard operating procedure that says if the wind is above 10 meters per second on the ground, it is likely that the wind speed is higher at altitude. We won't fly above 400 feet on those days. Something like that, some sort of limitation that allows for an understanding of what their increases on risk can be. Technically, you would need to have manufacturer competency. So basically it's saying 92205 or 92206. This is essentially safety assurance declaration. So this is a normal standard. And then does the manufacturer comply with the design standards that are set out? So near people or over people. And then reliability. So for this scenario, because it's a small drone, they're applying small drone rules against CARS 901, but they're saying you have to understand the risks of flying over 400 feet and what that means, even with your small drone, and understand what potential hazards there are. Signal strength, right? You're flying farther, you're flying higher. Is your signal strength still going to be good? Do you have any EMI considerations at the location you're going to fly? And then recovery from technical issues or human error. So this is not only your emergency response plan, but again, you go back to 922 and 905. And then have a good plan. So it comes into your con ops. We were talking about the concept of operations. Envelope protection. So in most cases, like it's saying here, like a DJI Matrice 300, so you're doing high altitude mapping, you're using the geofencing capability built into the drone. Human factors is going to be kind of falling into your crew fitness, but also talking about crew resource management. So how does everyone communicate issues, identify hazards, and mitigate them? And then environmental design is, again, it's manufacturer declaration and conformity. So that kind of comes a lot of times if you're applying for an SFOC and you're using a commonly used RPAS, so in this case, realistically DJI, in most situations, it's going to be a little bit easier to get an SFOC than if you're doing something novel. If you're building an airframe from scratch, you need to know the safety assurance standards front to back as a manufacturer, and you need to understand what that means. And then you've got to complete demonstrated compliance. So we talked quite a bit a week or two ago about safety assurance declarations and 922. That is something that as a manufacturer is kind of to reiterate it, a declaration of conformity and a safety assurance declaration are just that. They're declarations. You as a manufacturer are declaring the drone conforms to the standards that are set out. It is not an approval process. No one is saying you're approved to operate because you applied for something. You as a manufacturer you are declaring that you understand the risks and you're adopting the liability that comes with that by designing and operating that RPAS. The declaration of conformity doesn't eliminate the pilot in command from liability as the operator, but it certainly identifies what the limitations are of the drone. So, and then, yeah, it's the same for STSC4, so it kind of falls back into the same. So all of these move into Transport Canada. Let's get the form. So what does an application look like? A well-written application is going to be a singular document. Transport Canada loses their mind if you send them about 25 PDFs. They do not like that at all, trust me. And what does that mean? You must send the complete application at once. So you go to the SFOC, get permission for special drone operations. This kind of reiterates what we've just talked about and how to apply for it. So you must have a pilot certificate. You must have a TC and a PC number before you can get this started. You then complete the form, which is a PDF, and then you send it to RPAS center satp.tc.gc.ca. Like I said, it'll take up to 30 business days to review and issue. You will get automatically a case number as soon as you apply and it's a complete application. If you don't get an email response of a case number, your SFOC did not go to the right email. Ask me how I know. It took several days to figure that out. So you complete this form. Oh, they've modified it? Nope, it's still the same. So this form is, the top is all just general description information. This is not a complete SFOC application. This document is the cover page to your SFOC application. You should print this and then amend this with your PDF for everything that you need for your SFOC. So use Acrobat or use some sort of tool to merge, or just print everything and rescan it back in as an SFOC. But honestly, the best thing to do is to make it a searchable and a normal original PDF, because then Transport can work through it and actually find the references. Because As you move through the process, you will be assigned a technical inspector. The inspector will go through the document and find everything you messed up on, or they'll start asking you questions because they missed it, because GC is pretty busy and they're a little bit understaffed, unfortunately. So if you lay it out in a structure that makes sense for the application and is in a linear fashion, then that's going to make their lives a lot easier, and it's going to make your life a lot easier to actually ensure you have compliance. What does the structure look like? Let's go back to CARS 903. So let's go 903. By the way, here's the fine if you don't apply. It's $1,000 per instance, $5,000 to a corporation. Whenever you search for a CARS reference in the laws, it always brings you to the fines you'll get first, right? So these are all the individual fines, and then these are the corporate fines. The application, so this is CARS 90302. You can Google this on the CARS law, and this shows you the minimum format of what must be in an SFOC. If you were to basically take all of this and go point by point, that's one way that you can submit an SFOC. The other way to do it is to break it into the regulatory process we were talking about earlier on the slides. You can go through and do your site survey. You can do your concept of operation. You can then follow this. Where was that flow chart we were just looking at? This flow chart. You could structure your document like this as well. So doing the ConOps, doing the GRC, then moving through the ARC, then moving through to all your robustness, because each one of those are going to have very specific headings of things that you need to have, like the manufacturer's declaration, your pilot certificate, and just insert everything in a linear manner so that you know everything that is needed is there, because there is a matrix. Let me find that real quick. You will get a compliance matrix when you apply for a SFOC. So this is for a foreign pilot. So they're going to look for, have you completed the application form? And then the general requirements, right? So as per the CARS specific rules, a foreign pilot is pretty straightforward. It's going to be proof of operations, right? So this is an application for a commercial operator that's coming up to Canada. So we have developed a company operations manual and some DAA because they're also applying for a more complex SFOC at the same time. So you've got to work through all the standard stuff. And then if there's an advanced operation that's required, like say it's a special event, of course, if the pilot doesn't already have their advance, they're going to have to book. So like our flight reviewer in Calgary is taking care of that for us, for this client. We just basically have to demonstrate that there's compliance to go through the SFOC. For the complex stuff, it's going to be a multi-page matrix. So again, you could use the matrix as your formatting guideline for preparing that SFOC. Because that's the way they're going to go through. Transport's going to go through the matrix and look for presence of that. So either you can do callouts or you can have it in a linear manner and then just make everyone's life easy. So that is, and then like I said, you apply, they will provide you with a TC number and an inspector will pick up the file. Don't expect an immediate response. Do not apply for an SFOC with less than 30 business days of notice. It will get tossed out. They have just not enough time to respond to them with the workload that they have. So remember, there's 10,000 advanced pilots and there's only 150 SFOCs that made it through the pipeline in 2021. I'm not sure what 2022's numbers were, but I can't imagine it's much more than that. And realistically, it's just a lot of work. So the more work you can do on the front side, the less pain you're going to have getting it ready for approval and getting your operation off the ground. That's pretty much it. So questions?
Just a couple of things. One is super minor, but it has resulted in some time saving. Is in that draft of the 4 scenarios.
Yes.
It says specifically that Transport Canada would prefer to have KML files. And they have rejected them on my last few. So they don't want to handle the risk of viruses in files that are transmitted by email. So,
okay, so just draw it on your PDF then would be a better plan.
That's exactly the wording they used.
So if you get an SFOC approved, how long is it valid for? Just for that single operation, or can it be for a time frame?
So the SFOC are approved. It depends on the operation. So like that standard scenario 2, that's valid for anywhere in Canada. So it would be then a 12-month approval. So if you had a over 25 kilogram operation that you wanted to fly anywhere in Canada, as long as you conformed to the process that you define in the SFOC, and your site survey always follows the same format and the risk doesn't change, then you could use that SFOC again and again and again on any operation. So for example, like say you're a commercial film operator and you're running an Alta X, and an Alta X can be configured to fly a red full frame, and it's like 80 pounds by that point that it's up in the air. Well, if all of my documentation, all my procedures, everything makes sense, for every different film set I go to, I wouldn't need to apply for a new SFOC. I just have to renew it every year probably on the 12th month. Like on the 11th month, first day, I'd want to send in my new application so that I don't lose that SFOC. So all of this said, we're still waiting, and there's still no official word, but the notice to proposed amendment has been out for the last, was it 2020 that it came out? And the amendment proposal is to increase the maximum takeoff weight for CARS 901, so normal drone operations, advanced operations, from 25 kilograms up to 150 kilograms. So if you're going to fly, for example, an Agris T40, at some point when CG2 and Canada Gazette 2 comes out and it comes into law, there will be an amendment that allows for routine heavyweight drone operations. There'll of course be standard limitations. What also will likely happen is the amendment is going to be for advanced operations, but the training component of it might increase. There's still no clear information about this. It's kind of dragged on now for 2 years extra. So, because last year was talk that we would get it, and then now we're into halfway through March, and there hasn't been any official word on it. The official quote from every Transport Canada rep I've talked to about it, and I don't have the inside track on it, unfortunately, is soon. So I hope soon means this year, because not only is it going to be the 150 kilogram, it will also be low risk beyond visual line of sight. So my understanding, and this again is not exact knowledge or anything, this was shared at the conference, was most likely in Class G or low risk airspace over unpopulated areas, there will be a routine beyond visual line of sight capability up to a distance of, I think it was 8 kilometers. So it's going to be very similar to STSC 4. You will still need to have detect and avoid. So even though you're beyond visual line of sight, you can't just rock up in one spot and send the drone 8 kilometers in one direction. You will still need to have detect and avoid. So the best DAA is going to be, maybe you're operating from a mountaintop and you can then see for 10 kilometers and confidently say there's no aircraft in the area, but now you can't see the drone because it's just too small. Beyond like 800 meters, the drone is invisible. We have Pitt Meadows Airport to the north of us. I can see airplanes in the pattern, but I certainly couldn't see drones in the pattern. And that's probably 3 to 5 kilometers away, if not more. So that's where the routine low risk beyond line of sight will kind of really open up the door for people that are doing mapping or photogrammetry. So that could be pretty exciting again. And it will probably require either a more stringent flight review process or harder training or confirmation of ground school. So before CARS Part 9 came out in 2019, it used to be you had to have proof of 20 hours of attendance of ground school for drone operations in order to get your SFOC. And then they went to, well, you don't have to have proof, you just have to pass the test. Well, most likely what's going to happen now is you have to pass the test, you have to pass a flight review, and you also have to have proof of some sort of training, which basically the SFOC right now requires anyway. You have to prove competency. And then if there's any specific training that's required for the operation you're doing, you also have to prove that. So things kind of balloon from that anyway. So it's not unreasonable to think that's what's going to happen next. But Your guess is as good as mine right now, where TC's pretty mum on this. So let's hope that something exciting happens in the next couple months. So other than that, I think that's pretty much it for SFOCs. I'm doing a lot of them lately, so I figured it was on my mind. I might as well share what's been on my mind and really explain the process, because it is labor intensive. Certainly there's people in our community like Bill that offer consulting as well. We offer consulting for doing these more complex operations. So you can reach out, we can either assist internally, or we can put you in touch with people that can assist on it. We've been working with other people as well, just because some of this it's so time intensive, and a lot of it is just paperwork driven. So if you've got an operation that you think you want to do and you're being held back by 901, visual line of sight over 400, et cetera, that we've all talked about, don't make non-compliance your route to running your business. Obviously the fines aren't worth it. The reputational risk isn't worth it. Your insurance won't cover it if you have an incident or an accident. And it's just not good for the industry for us to see an operation go sideways because someone decided the paperwork or the process was too arduous, when there are resources out there to get that job done safely and legally.